Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is a podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah. I missed you last week. At the end of the last episode, I talked about rescheduling and all of that wonderful stuff that happens in people's lives, and we did not end up having an episode last week. Still working on rescheduling the one author, and my life just got a little crazy with other things last week. I did want to do something in terms of an episode, and that did not happen, so I am sad. And I missed talking with an author and with you, my lovely listeners, so that's just how life works sometimes. I hope that you are having a good week. Hope you had a great weekend. Stayed warm. I know it's January and some places are cold. It's been a weird winter. Very, very weird. Like, there was a 70-degree temperature difference. Both my mom and my sister texted me. I was talking to my mom on the phone, and then my sister texted me and said, it's 70 degrees warmer than the last time we talked about the weather, because it was negative 30 and then the high was supposed to be 40 today, I think. So that's always crazy. And then the high here is supposed to be 70 tomorrow. And so if it was negative, if that happened on the day that my mom and my sister were at negative 30, that is 100-degree temperature difference, which just feels wrong. But, yeah, I don't know. It's kind of crazy. We had an okay weekend. I worked a lot this weekend and got some stuff done that needed to get done. I still have many, many things that also need to get done. But I also took time out from the things that, that have to get done, that aren't always fun, and did some things just for me. I read, I crocheted, I, hung out with the hubby and the puppies, and because the weather's been so nice, we are going for our daily walks again, and because my hubby's finally feeling better, we are going for our daily walks again. We went today and met a lovely young family, baby, mom, and grandma from the Czech Republic. Those were the first people here that we had met from the Czech Republic. I think I've mentioned this before, but I have a friend that I send texts to after we've gone for our lunchtime walk with the dogs and say, we had a lovely walk today. Today we met people from Germany, from England, I like to list the countries because my husband is very, very extroverted and he loves to meet people and chat them up, whereas I would smile and probably just keep walking. He likes to talk to people. So today we met a lovely family from the Czech Republic and had not met someone specifically on our walks from Czech Republic, so that was new and fun. We talked about where we should go if we ever do visit the Czech Republic, which is on our list. Of course, I would love to see Prague, and they live in, I can't remember the name of the city. Breen, does that sound right? Something like that. She said they live near the second largest city, so I will look it up, but she said that is beautiful, and so someday it's on that list that might be longer, well, at least equivalent to my TBR, just all the places that I want to go visit someday. So that was my afternoon walk, and now here I am with you to bring you an author interview. Today I am speaking with author Edward Cahill about his historical fiction novel, Disorderly Men. Let me go ahead and give you the description of that book. And actually, before I give you the description, I will tell you that Disorderly Men, this is from the Amazon description, is the winner of the 2023 Best Indie Book Award for LGBTQ2 fiction. It is on Lambda Literary Review's September Most Anticipated list, and it is one of Queer 40's best Pride reads for summer of 2023. So that's very cool. Those are some very cool accolades. Now, the description of the book. 3 gay men in pre-Stonewall New York City find their fates thrown together in the police raid of a village bar. Roger Moorhouse is a Wall Street banker and Westchester family man with a preciously guarded secret. As the shouting begins and flashlights blaze in his face, the life he's carefully curated over the years. A fancy new office overlooking Lower Broadway, a house in Beechmont Woods, his wife and children, is about to come crashing down around him. Columbia literature professor Julian Prince lives a comparatively uncloseted life when he finds his first committed relationship tested to its limits. How could he explain to Gus, a fearless young artist, that he couldn't stay with him that weekend because the woman who was still technically Julian's fiancée would be visiting? But when Gus is struck unconscious by a police baton, Julian comes out of hiding to protect him, even if exposure means losing everything. For Danny Duffy, an Irish kid from the Bronx with a sassy mouth and a diverse group of friends, the raid is a galvanizing Spartacus moment. Danny doesn't have too much left to lose. His family has just disowned him. But once his name appears in the newspaper, he'll be fired from his job at Sloan's Supermarket, where he's risen to assistant manager of produce, and begin a journey that veers between political enlightenment and violent revenge. The 3 men find themselves in a police wagon together, their hidden lives threaten to be revealed to the world. Blackmail, a private investigator, Gus's disappearance, and Danny's quest for retribution propel Disorderly Men to its piercing conclusion, as each man meets the boundaries of his own fear, love, and shame. The stakes for each are different, but all of them confront a fundamental question. How much happiness is he allowed to have, and what share of it will he lay claim to? I love how detailed that description is. That is a very detailed description of Disorderly Men. You get a good snapshot of each of the 3 main characters, Danny, Julian, and Roger, and what drives them. This is definitely a character-driven novel, and Edward talks a little bit about that during our interview. You really get to find out what is making these men, what propels them in their decision-making, why they have lived their lives the way they have up until this point. This is, I think, 1962. As it said, pre-Stonewall. So life for the queer community was very, very different. You had to be incredibly closeted in a lot of ways. I mean, the book opens with a police raid on a bar where a number of men are arrested for being gay. They're arrested for lewd acts in public. There's a whole slew of charges that are brought against them, but it's because they are gay. That's the only reason they're arrested. And in some ways, it's so hard to imagine that life. I mean, unfortunately, it's not hard to imagine that in other ways because of the things we hear in the news all the time, but we have made progress, and so to be arrested just for being in a bar and being perceived as gay is, to me, astounding. And so this is historical fiction, but it's really important to understand what came before and what led people to fight for the rights that the LGBTQIA plus community has now and is continuing to fight for. So it's character driven, so you really get to see into the minds of these 3 men, what drives them, what compels them, etc. So let's go ahead and let Edward talk about the book and the writing of the book. Again, it is called Disorderly Men. Let's go to the interview. Hello, Edward. Welcome to the podcast.
Hello, Sarah. Very nice to be here.
It's nice to have you here. I am happy to have you and excited to talk about your book, Disorderly Men. Before we do that, though, if you wouldn't mind sharing just a little bit about yourself so my listeners can get to know you, that would be great.
Sure. I am a fiction writer and English professor based in New York City. I teach at Fordham University. I've been there for 19 years, and I started writing fiction about 8 years ago.
Wonderful. And before we started recording, we were just talking about New York, the weather, etc. But I don't know. I have a romantic notion of living in New York. I'm not sure I actually could do it.
One of the best things, I mean, there's so many things in New York that call me. It's not an easy place to live, but there are so many writers in New York, and I think that's one of the reasons that I stay. I love the museums, and I love all the the other culture, but there are a lot of writers in New York, and it's really nice to have writers at my disposal.
Sure, yeah, because writing can be very isolating, so it's nice to have them close, I would imagine.
Yeah, sharing manuscripts, talking shop. And just having other models for how to have a writing life and how to be productive without driving yourself crazy.
Very important, yes. Well, in terms of the book, it is called Disorderly Men. Can you give an overview of that story?
Sure. It's about three men who are arrested in the police raid of a gay bar in Greenwich Village in 1962. And it follows their lives for about 2 weeks thereafter, as that event really just kind of brings them to a precipice where they have to decide how important their happiness is, and how important living honestly is. So in a lot of ways, it's three coming out stories. Although coming out in 1962 means something different than I think it does now. But there's a touch of noir, a touch of classic melodrama. I think a lot of deep character, but also a pretty action-packed plot.
And the fact that it starts with this raid and the arrest of not only these three men, but a whole group of men in this gay bar, I think for some people some people who lived through this period or who are familiar with history, LGBTQ history, it will be less shocking, I think, than maybe some people who are not as aware of that time period. A coming out story, as you said, is much different today. And the fact that they were arrested simply for being in a bar and being suspected of being gay is going to seem crazy to some people. Can you talk a little bit about just that period in history and why you wanted to write about it?
Yeah. So, in the really after World War II, the mobilization of so many men and women made queer community possible. So queer men and women were finding each other. By 1962, we still hadn't really built communities with media, and culture was still pretty underground, because as all of that happened, there was a backlash. And so lots of anti-gay laws, disorderly conduct laws, lewd vagrancy laws, sodomy laws were enforced pretty aggressively in New York City between what are the dates? It's 1933, I think, in 1966, something like 50,000 men were arrested for disorderly conduct, and essentially just simply being gay. Either they were dancing with another man, or they were wearing the wrong clothing, or they made the wrong gesture. So queer people had to live in secrecy. They had to be careful who they told. They had to be careful how they associated. So it's really a very, very different world. But it's also a world right on the cusp of radical change, right? 7 years later, we have Stonewall. But in fact, throughout the late 1950s and 1960s, you had a series of protests in Los Angeles and San Francisco and New York. And gradually, gay people were deciding to stand up for themselves and fight back. And so in a way, this is a story about three men who decide to stand up for themselves and fight back.
It is time for our first break of this episode, now that you have an overview of the book, and that just seems like a really good place to stop. It's a story about three men who decide to stand up for themselves and fight back. That's the perfect place to go to the break. We're going to continue this conversation after the break. Stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Do Do you want to be healthier, yet you just don't know what to do? All these shows telling you this and that, but nothing seems to work. Well, listen close. Golden State Media Concepts has got something great for you. The Health and Wellness Podcast dedicated to workout trends, healthy eating habits, diet, and everything about healthy living. Join us in our banters as we help you not just live life to the fullest, but live it to the healthiest.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am speaking today with Edward Cahill about his novel Disorderly Men. Before the break, he had just described what the book is about, given an overview, and concluded with it is a story about three men who decide to stand up for themselves and fight back. And they all do that in different ways. But just to remind you of that so we can go into this next part of the conversation. Because just the simple act of going to a bar on a certain night, they're arrested. It could have absolutely, and it changes their lives, but it could have absolutely ruined their lives in so many different ways. I think we have a long way to go with LGBTQ rights in the world today, but at least there has been progress in that regard.
Well, yeah, I think one of the reasons we're seeing another backlash right now, in 2023, there were more anti-gay laws passed at the state level than ever before. And the reason is, I think, because we have made so much progress. Now, I think that progress is, it's local and regional. There are some places where it is still very much not okay to be gay, and where it's still very, very hard to grow up gay. But yeah, there's been a ton of progress. And I hope kind of one of the things that my book, shows people is that this history of oppression is really very, very recent. So I think it's something we can be proud of, but certainly not something we want to take for granted either.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so you mentioned that this is told from the points of view of three different men in the story, Roger, Julian, and Danny. Can you talk about each of them a little bit and how they might resonate with readers?
Sure. So Roger is, something I want to say first is that Roger, Julian, and Danny are cis white men. They don't represent the diversity of queer experience in New York City in 1962, but they're three characters that I knew how to write. Roger is, he's a banker. He's a Westchester family man. He's got two kids. He's got a wife, and he is as in the closet as you can be. Julian is a Columbia literature professor, a Shakespeare professor, and he's got a pretty complicated life, but he's relatively out, if one can be out in 1962, which was always a relative thing. He's got gay friends, and he's just fallen in love with a young man. As our story begins. And then Danny is an Irish grocery clerk who lives in the Bronx. And he's got a lot less to lose than these two. And so when he's arrested, his response is a bit more radical. And as Roger and Danny are trying to figure out how to preserve both their lives and their integrity, Danny is trying to figure out how to make progress in the world, and considering his radical options.
And he has a different experience than the other two in terms of the arrest and what happens afterwards. And I, of course, don't want to give a lot away, but it's understandable the direction that he goes in from what happened to him that night.
Yeah, I think, Roger and Julian are both dealing with a lot of fear and a lot of shame. But Danny really is dealing with anger. He was such an interesting character to write because, he's in his early 20s. He's relatively unformed. He's had a pretty easy go of it. And then suddenly he's not having an easy go of it, but he's resourceful, and he's smart. And he comes to realize that fighting back against this system that he's sort of discovering is in place to oppress him becomes his goal. So many of the stories about queer lives that were told in the mid-century period end up with suicides, or queer characters either dying or sort of fading into obscurity, ending very pessimistically. And I wanted to tell a story that took place in that same time, that same very, very difficult time, where people didn't know very much and they were often quite afraid. They had very few resources, where the characters had the courage to stand up and fight back. Because I think the history of queer people in the 20th century was often a history of fighting back. We don't see it because we know it was also a history of hiding in the shadows. So many of the queer stories from that period, The Well of Loneliness, The City and the Pillar, The Children's Hour, they end really, really badly. And I wanted to tell a story that had some hope in it, that showed queer people really believing that their lives were worth fighting for, and that they had the courage to do it. I think if you grow up as a gay kid, it becomes a bit of a fantasy to stand up and fight back against the bullies who oppress you. It's the thing that you imagine one day you're going to do. So perhaps there's a touch of wish fulfillment here, but I think it's also historical. Queer people have stood up and fought back. And so I wanted to imagine what it would actually be like to do that, and how difficult it would be, and how scary it would be to do that, but also how inspiring, given how bleak the world looks to these three men at the time that they're arrested. And how much ingenuity it takes to figure out how to get to the other side of it.
And you said, maybe it's wish fulfillment, but at the same time, I think as a kid growing up gay and wanting to grow up and fight back at some point, it's important not only to have that representation of seeing yourself in books, but also to have that hope that, it's not going to be easy, but here's a story that might inspire me to be able to do that one day, and to know how difficult it might be, but also to know that it is possible.
Yeah, it's possible. And that there really is a legacy of it. In 1962, the same year that my story is told, in Madison Square Garden, there was a boxer named Emil Griffith, and he was gay. And an opponent made anti-gay slurs at him in the fight, and he beat him to death. And it's not exactly a model of resistance I would want to advocate, but on the other hand, it was a story that got a lot of media attention at the time, and I think it stands as a reminder that queer people are people, and people, when you push them too far, are going to fight back.
Absolutely. And it's also, I think we hear a lot about, with the current wave of anti-gay sentiment and anti-gay legislation, this just didn't exist in my time. Well, it did. People were just so very hidden because they had to be. And it's good in that way to tell the stories and to know that they have existed throughout history. Relationships have existed throughout history.
Well, yeah, I mean, so many of the great writers in the English tradition, and lots of other traditions too, were gay. And I think gay history is having a real moment now. I feel lucky that my book is coming out at a time when there's a lot of gay historical novels coming out that are really very, very good. There's a limited series on streaming and films. I think we're at a moment, and maybe it's because of the political progress we've made, where culture producers are saying it's time for these stories to be told, and that there's a lot of interest, and it's interest that goes beyond gay audiences. I think that's probably the most important thing.
And in terms of going beyond gay audiences, queer audiences, etc., what do you hope that just the average reader might take away from the book?
The book probably has a politics, and I'm sure it's a pro-gay politics, but ultimately it's a story about three characters who are in a trial for their lives, and I think coming out stories are always existential trials. Everything is at stake if you believe that coming out could be the end of you. And so facing who you are, facing your internalized shame and your external oppression is a really interesting and dramatic thing. So I want people who don't know about that confrontation of self and other to get a sense of what it might have felt like under the most difficult of circumstances. I think these are characters who have a lot of shame that they have to confront, and I think a lot of people carry a lot of shame. So this is a story about confronting shame. It's a story about confronting fear, and it's a story about love and finding the capacity to love and the courage to love in a context that doesn't seem so hospitable for it.
When it comes to your characters and writing those characters, how does that process work for you? Do you like to have a really good character sketch before you start writing, or do you prefer to have them evolve as you write, or a combination thereof?
I talk about this with my students, and writing character is so interesting. It's so important, but it's almost impossible, I think, at least it is impossible for me to imagine a character fully formed. And the only way a character really becomes a character is if you build him, and you build him out of habits and tendencies and actions and reactions and thoughts and dialogue. And I had an idea for Roger, Julian, and Danny, but I didn't really come to know them until I'd been working on the novel for about a year. And once enough of those pieces were in place, just decisions, I'm going to give Julian this habit. I'm going to give Roger that tendency. I'm going to have Danny do this. And then I finally began to see who they really are. And at that point, I could know how they would respond in any situation. But it certainly did take a while. I knew Roger was going to be a banker, and Julian was going to be a Shakespeare professor, and Danny was going to be a grocery clerk. But I hadn't yet figured out how they would respond to the world, and that took a while. But it really is it's something that one constructs, I think, at least for me, and it takes a while. And there's something even sort of strangely logical about it. Once you have a kind of a critical mass of habits and attributes, that character becomes a real person.
It is time for our second break of this episode. When we come back, more about characters and character development. Stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my conversation with Edward Cahill. Before the break, Edward was talking about characters and character development, and let's go ahead and pick up that conversation again. Well, and one thing that I smiled about is the character of Gus. Early in the book, this is just a random comment, but he just dropped the word "ope" into a sentence, and Gus is from the Midwest, and that for some reason just made me smile a lot because that's so very Midwestern, and it's not an important detail, but it was true to his character, and it made me smile. So take that as you will.
I love that. I did an awful lot of research on that, and I tried really hard to get it right without it being too obtrusive. But it for me, it was just some little tick of Gus's that made him kind of extra adorable and not of New York City. And I wanted him to be not of New York City. So thank you so much for noticing that.
It was a very non-New York City word phrasing of things. How about research? I'm sure you did a lot of research for the story and the book. What stands out for you in terms of research?
You know, I'm a trained researcher, so I know how to do lots of research, and I love doing research, so I could do it for days, for weeks, for months, for years. But when I started this project, I made the decision not to spend a year doing research on 1962 in New York City. I read Fred Kaplan's book, 1959, which was really, really useful. James Baldwin's Another Country is one of my favorite books. That takes place in New York City around the same time. I'd read so many books and seen so many films that I had a sense of what this period was like. And because I'm a historian, a lot of my research was to make sure that my sense was historically accurate. But I didn't want to lead with the research. You know, there's sort of, if you're a historical novelist and your research, you kind of wear your research on your sleeve, you failed. And, you know, people notice that. And I would never want to do that. I want my research to be absolutely invisible. So what I would really kind of aim for is to go for an impression, right? A feeling, an effect that felt like 1962. And then I just had to make sure that, in fact, that's exactly how it would have happened. That didn't happen 2 or 3 years later. This is what people were doing in New York City. There's a mid-century feeling that I really wanted to achieve with this novel. That's just so very different from our contemporary lives. And I think I manifest that not only in plot details and description of places and current events, but also in language, and the way characters speak, and the way that they think about the world. So rather than going for a factually true 1962, I really wanted to deliver the feel of 1962, and then just make sure I didn't make any mistakes.
And I think that's important because just simple details, for instance, like Danny's pompadour, or just the different details of clothing, or certain words, again with just simple words from that phrase, can really evoke that time period.
Yeah, and I think the setting is really important, but I tend to funnel everything through character. So if Danny is going to manifest 1962 through his pompadour, that pompadour really needs to be a part of who he is. If they make a reference to a play that they saw or a film that they saw, they like to be Danny and Gabriel, his friend, like to be very campy. Those moments really are character moments. This is the kind of man that he is. It's a secondary effect that it reminds the reader that this is all happening in 1962, but really it's happening to this character. These things, these details emerge because they're something that this character cares about, that this character notices, that this character thinks is important.
Right, which is important when it's character driven, rather than plot driven or even location driven. You can still get that sense of plot and location through the characters and their actions and the way they speak. So, what do you think it is about this genre of historical fiction that draws you to write within it?
I mean, I'm a historicist. I want to know where everything comes from. I think I've always been a bit of an anachronism as a human being. I've been drawn to earlier times, not always understanding my own historical moment very well. I think as a writer, I mean, I've spent the last 20 plus years teaching 18th and 19th century literature. So there's a way of making sentences that we just don't really engage in anymore. That's always been just so pleasing to me. I love in particular, the mid-century style, John Cheever and Richard Yates. I love that. Baldwin for sure. I love that style. I wanted in this novel to create a kind of pastiche of the mid-century novel, to make it really sound like it was a novel from the mid-century, because it's just so appealing to me. I've done a little bit of writing, mostly in short fiction, that's much more contemporary, and it just feels like a whole different kind of thing. I love being in the historical past. And I think imagining worlds that we think we know, and then sort of delivering some surprises, because one of the ways we come to history is through sort of caricatures. We think of the 1950s as this sort of morally rigid time. In fact, the 1950s, there's so much experimentation going on. And so it's interesting to be in a historical moment and then kind of uncover the aspects of it that readers might not be so familiar with.
Yeah. Are there other writings that you would like to highlight during our time together?
Well, I have a short story called The Ice Cube that is going to be in the Saints and Sinners anthology, from the Saints and Sinners Literary Festival in New Orleans, where I'll be in March, also at the Tennessee Williams Festival, promoting Disorderly Men. It's actually my first published short story, so I'm excited about that, and it's a contemporary story. But the book that I'm working on right now is another historical novel, and yet it's not set in the mid-century period. It's actually set in colonial Boston. I spent a lot of time as a scholar thinking about colonial Boston, and colonial British America. And when I stopped doing scholarship about 8 years ago, I kind of swore I'd never work on that material again. But as I was casting about for a second book, I found myself just drawn to the period, drawn to the language, and drawn to the kind of the satirical possibility of thinking about, what's now U.S. culture at this very nascent stage, and having an awful lot of fun with it. So that's what I'm working on right now, but it's still early days.
I love that. That's just very different from the time period of the current book.
Well, as I was thinking about a second novel, I love this mid-century period, and had so many ideas for narrating the struggle of queer people, and there's so many different possibilities. But that I just found myself thinking, I want to grow as a writer. I want new challenges. There's going to be no sequel to Disorderly Men. I'm not sorry to say. Those characters, their stories end where the novel ends, and I series are very popular these days, and series do really well because readers like to return to the same characters. But I feel like I want to grow as a writer, and so the book I'm working on right now is very, very different. It's not a gay novel exactly, but it's still a little gay.
Well, and I would imagine it's nice to challenge yourself. I know for myself, staying in my comfort zone can be very tempting. So to, just stay within that mid-century novel. I wrote it. I liked it. I was great there, but to challenge yourself to write in a different time period and, in a different setting, I think is probably important.
I think one of the most exciting things about writing novels for me is the moments, and sometimes they last a while, where you're not sure you can actually do it, where you feel like you may have bitten off more than you can chew. And I wouldn't want to be in any other place, because I know if it's going to be good, if it's going to be worth my time, if it's going to be worth a reader's time, then it has to be that much of a challenge. And so it's very exciting at this point where to have an idea of a novel that feels at this point too difficult for me to pull off. I think in the end I have confidence that I will be able to pull it off, but right now I don't know how.
That's terrifying, but also a little exciting because I'm not you.
Yes.
In terms of writing, it's clear from your profession that books are important to you, probably always have been. What was the impetus that made you decide you wanted to try writing for publication?
Out of college, I waited tables and I wrote short stories, and I had no luck. And I really didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know the difference between telling a good story and writing a good sentence. And I was very good at writing good sentences, but I didn't know how to tell stories. And I found myself kind of drawn into graduate school, and then I became a literature professor. And I started publishing in a scholarship. And my first book is about literary culture in the early United States. And, it's all very, very interesting to me. It's a very different kind of writing. It's a pretty limited audience. And I was in the middle of a second book, sitting in the New York Public Library about 8 years ago. And I was about halfway through this book. Lots of, monographs in front of me, all my research in front of me. And I thought to the future where maybe 150, 200 people would read this book that I was pouring my heart and soul into. And a part of me said, I want a bigger audience. So I pushed everything aside, and I knew instantly I wanted to see if I could try to write a novel. So I wrote a couple of chapters and started to feel good about it. I wrote a few more. It started to take shape. And then I realized at that point that I was, in fact, writing a novel.
It is time for our final break of this episode. When we come back, Edward will share his advice for authors. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the backdoors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and the conclusion of my interview with author Edward Cahill. From your experience then as a writer as well as a literature professor, what advice would you have for aspiring authors?
Well, having written a book makes it so much easier to write a book. A novel is a big project. So if you've ever handled a big project, even if it's not a book, but it's just a big project with lots of moving parts, it's good to have that experience because, a novel does require, you have to be in charge of a lot of information. You have to keep a lot of notes. You have to have a calendar of events. You have to manage so much, and it can be really overwhelming. So my first piece of advice is, figure out how to not be overwhelmed by the scope of a novel because it can be very overwhelming. being organized certainly helps. And having experience with big projects helps. And patience, I think, too. It's very difficult to see a novel all at once. And so just having patience and a little bit of faith that if you keep working at it, eventually it's going to come into view. I think the thing that I learned most writing Disorderly Men was that for me, it didn't have to be good. The draft that I wrote at the end of the day didn't have to be good. If I kept the bar relatively low, I could keep writing, and I could keep writing every single day. And I had to sort of relax that censor in my brain that says it has to be perfect. It has to be perfect. Because I think that censor would have just discouraged me too much. So my rule number one, every day, it doesn't have to be good. And that really kind of taught me the confidence that I could make it good. It just didn't have to be good, in the first draft.
I think that's so important because I think it's so easy to be overwhelmed with trying to get it right as opposed to just getting it written and then working on getting it right.
Yeah, it takes time to get it right. And, that first draft, in so many ways, is a record of your previous ignorance. You didn't know what you were doing until you finished that first draft. That first draft taught you what you were doing, but now you've got this big mess on your hands. All of these moments where you've sort of written into the text, you're not knowing what you were doing, right? So the draft is a tool to teach you what it is that you're trying to do. And so, revision is the thing that turns that record of previous ignorance into something really good. And I believe in revision. I revise and revise and revise. I'm sure I revised Disorderly Men 50 times, which took forever because it's about 120,000 words maybe. But that was the only way I could do it. To just keep coming back to it and seeing it and staying really intimate with it. I think one of the most important pieces I have for anyone of advice I have for anyone trying to write a novel is to stay with it, be close to it all the time. Because if you take breaks, you lose that feeling of mastery, right? That feeling of understanding exactly how everything should be. So that when you're revising, when you've made a mistake, when you've missed an opportunity. If you step away for a while, you have to kind of spend some time getting intimate with again, right? A novel is a little bit like a lover. You have to be in there close, and you have to know, and you have to pay attention. You have to devote the time. And when you have done that, you can be really attuned to what's going on and what needs fixing.
You mentioned the organizational aspect of it, and everybody comes at this from their own perspective. For you, what's one of the main ways you keep yourself organized in terms of writing and all of that information that you have to manage?
I wish that I had a better system than I do. I just have a whole bunch of Microsoft Word files that I return to. I have a calendar, so I know what's happening on every day. So that if I have one character doing something on a Saturday and it's raining, then when that other character comes in on a Saturday, it's still raining because it needs to be raining on that Saturday. Lots of biographies. I really want to know everything I can about characters. I want to know, how they've lived their lives and what their favorite things are. So keep lots of notes like that.
Okay, fair enough. When you take time to read, just for you, what are your favorite genres and some of your favorite authors?
I mean, I love gay literary fiction. Alan Hollinghurst is one of my favorite authors. Calm to Bean, one of my favorite authors. I've been teaching a lot of contemporary literature at Fordham lately. In fact, I have a class now that I call Very Contemporary American Fiction, and it's just novels that I decide I want to read from, published within the last couple of years. Ben Lerner is a favorite of mine. Patricia Lockwood I've really liked. Ocean Vuong. This year I'm going to read the new Justin Torres novel, Blackouts, and Emma Cline's The Guest. I think there's just so much exciting things happening in contemporary fiction right now. I read In Memoriam by Alice Wynne, and just absolutely fell in love with it. Tom Crew has a novel called The New Life about two sexologists in late Victorian England daring to publish this innovative and controversial work. So there's so much really good gay historical fiction being published right now, and I think it's an exciting time for writers and certainly for readers.
Thank you for that. In terms of internet presence, in case people want to know more about the book, more about you, if you have a website, if you can share that, as well as any social media that you're active on.
Sure. Yeah, they can go to edwardcahill, all one word, .net. That's my website. And you can learn more about Disorderly Men and my public appearances. I'll be at the Beacon Hill Books and Cafe in February. That's in Boston. And as I said, the Tennessee Williams Festival and Saints and Sinners Festival in New Orleans in March. I'm on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter, now known as X.
All right, wonderful. Thank you so much for joining me to talk about Disorderly Men and writing. I really appreciate the time you took. Thank you.
It's been my pleasure, Sarah.
Thank you again to Edward for joining me to talk about Disorderly Men and writing. If you are a fan of historical fiction, of character-driven novels, if you're at all interested in the history of this time for the LGBTQIA plus community, it's incredibly important history, and this novel I think really gives you a good insight not only into that history but also the political climate of the time, the feelings of the time, through the actions and reactions of the three main characters of this book. It's a really good look at this time period in history and helps to explain what is going on with that community today as well. So definitely a must read for a lot of people. If you are interested, you should definitely check it out. If you have someone in your life who might be interested in this particular book, then get it for them as whatever present. I don't know, Valentine's Day is coming up. Or just because, hey, it's Tuesday, here's a book. Those are my favorite kinds of presents. Definitely check this book out, and you can follow Edward you can find his website and the social media, etc. if you want to know more or looking for more information after hearing this interview. We have another episode coming up on Friday. Yes, we do. That interview is done. It was another one that I talked about the last episode that got rescheduled a couple of times, but it happened, and that is good. So I will be speaking to two authors and twins. First time to have I had brothers on the podcast once, but this time it is sisters, and they are identical twins. Argita and Datina Zali will be joining me to talk about their memoir, Good Morning Hope. So join me for that episode on Friday. Of course, if you follow, like, subscribe on the platform on which you are listening, then you will be notified when there are new episodes. So it will take all of the guesswork out of your listening experience. You will know when there are new episodes. Even when my schedule gets a little bit wonky, you will know when there are new episodes. You can also leave a review on that platform if you would be so kind, written, starred, one sentence, one paragraph, whatever it is in you to leave as a review. It helps, and I am grateful for that help because it gets the podcast out to more listeners. So thank you in advance for that. And also social media. If you want to follow the podcast, you can do so on Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram. Love hearing from listeners. I know I say that every week, but it's because I do love hearing from you. So find the podcast and by extension me on social media and let me know what you are reading. Have you read some of the books from the authors that I interview? Has one of these interviews inspired you to go get that book and read it? What were your thoughts, etc.? Love hearing from you. So please do find me on social media. Me being the book podcast, of course. I hope you're having a great week so far. I am looking forward to speaking to you again on Friday. In the meantime, stay warm wherever you are and find yourself plenty of time to wrap up in a blanket, get yourself a hot beverage, and get lost in a good book. Thank you so much.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.